We all know I'm not a fan of the witch trials, okay? We know this. Why? Because the thought process behind it was stupid. It was so stupid, and an accusation was a death sentence. But is it the only period of time I'm glad I wasn't a part of? No, because there were tons more. Welcome back to Top 10. I'm your host, Rachel Fisher, and today we are counting down our list of top 10 events in history scarier than the Salem Witch Trials. From waves of disease to the unexpected, all this and more will be featured only in today's video. Let's go. Number 10. The Black Plague. Speaks for itself, really. I mean, I would still take COVID over this any day, but like, The Black Plague was a wave of death and disease that struck fear into any who encountered it. Not only was the time period incredibly ill-equipped to handle it, a miracle we survived. What with basically no knowledge of hygiene whatsoever, it was a painful ordeal. Blood and pus-filled boils would emerge, followed by fever, chills, vomiting, violent number twos, and aches and pains, which would inevitably end up in death. People who were perfectly healthy when they went to bed might have ended up dead the next morning. It was that fast. People did everything they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused to see patients. If they did, their procedures were dangerous and unsanitary. I think what scares me the most about this is the lack of understanding around the disease or disease in general. No one had any idea what was causing it, and if you thought isolation was bad, imagine doing that without telephones, iPads, social media, or Skype. You would have no idea what was going on with your family. So yeah, definitely the Black Plague. It's up there. Number 9, the King James witch hunts. Of course, we have to add some more witch hunts to this list because there were many, and this time they weren't hanged, they were burned at the stake. Not fun. And this by mere scale was much worse than the Salem Witch Trials. For some reason, King James I of England had something against women. Oh, sorry, I meant witches. 85% of the people accused were women. King James believed that he and his Danish bride had been specifically targeted by witches after encountering a dangerous storm while trying to cross the North Sea, which, by the way, is notoriously bad to cross anyways. He believed the storm was conjured, and the first he accused was Galis Duncan. Her employer David Seaton forced a confession out of her through torment, after which she named several accomplices. Duncan retracted her confession, but it was too late. The witch trials began, and in 1591 Agnes Sampson confessed that 200 witches sailed to the church of North Berwick on Halloween night in 1590. There the devil preached to them and they began to plot the king's destruction. The convicted witches were burned at the stake, a much more terrifying way to die than by hanging, even though that's still bad, and over 100 were implicated, with many being executed. Because how do you disprove something that's not real? Number 8, zombies. A real life zombie apocalypse, anyone? For me, no thank you. I'm not nearly as scared of witches as I probably should be, but I definitely don't want to be anywhere near a zombie movie. Unless Simon Pegg and Nick Frost are involved, because I love them. I would sell my soul for that. While many of us like to romanticize the Renaissance, it actually had a mini zombie infestation, specifically in Italy, and a major outbreak of syphilis broke out in 1494, which is probably one of the most horrific STDs known to mankind. If untreated, it can literally eat your face off. In the mid-15th to 16th century, Italy was a field of war, which most likely led to the infection, with all the comings and goings of travelers and the affairs. They had awful ways of treating it, many of which involved the use of hot pokers in places I can't nor want to mention. I'm not sure what terrifies me more, the disease or the medical care used to treat it. It affected most of the nobility, especially those in the military, who would often seek out extramarital affairs. The son of Pope Alexander VI is one famous example. Cesare Borgia had to wear a leather mask to hide the disfigurement from the disease. But if you couldn't hide behind the wealth, then you were left wandering the streets in a terrifying half-melted, feverish state. Number 7, Pompeii. A massive world-ending explosion, suffocating thousands and covering their corpses with lava sound great to anyone? No, me neither. The fact that people still live in and around Pompeii astounds me. You know it could happen again, right? Right around lunchtime on August 24th, 79 CE, a huge earth-shattering eruption blasted volcanic debris all over the city of Pompeii. Over the next few days, clouds of blistering hot gases swarmed the city, buildings were destroyed, the population was either crushed or suffocated. The city was literally covered in ash and stone for centuries until it was finally unearthed in the 1700s. I visited the city, and the stone corpses frozen in whatever position they were in when they died is haunting, to say the least. Absolutely terrifying. Mount Vesuvius, the volcano mentioned, sits above an 154-mile deep pit of magma, and scientists think it's overdue for an eruption. So yes, I would take the Salem Witch Trials over that any day. Number 6, Jack the Ripper. An unknown killer preying on London, committing horrendous and brutal acts? Yeah, no thanks. I don't even like doing lists about the serial individuals we have mentioned. I would take a witch over Ted Bundy or Ed Gein any day. Because there's nothing in question there. They are real. Witches? Don't know. But Jack the Ripper remains one of the most terrifying serial killings of history and remains unsolved. In the East End of London in 1888, 5 gruesome murders took place in Whitechapel. Not only were their lives taken, but their corpses were mutilated in nightmarish ways. The crimes had a huge impact on society as a whole up until that point. Crimes such as that had never been so heavily in the press. The name Jack the Ripper became coined after a haunting letter sent to the London News Agency was signed by Jack. This was just one of the letters he sent, one being accompanied by a kidney preserved in wine. Number 5, Holodomor. The Holodomor was the first genocide that was meticulously planned out in order to cause the most suffering. The withholding of food was used as a weapon. Between 1932 to 1933, millions of Ukrainians were killed by a man-made famine engineered by Joseph Stalin. Rural farmers made up of 80% of Ukraine's population, and they were the primary ones hit. After World War I and the fall of the Russian monarchy, Ukraine established the independent Ukrainian People's Republic in January 1918. They fought the Bolshevik army for 3 years but eventually fell and was forced to be a part of the Soviet Union. Stalin's vendetta against Ukrainian farmers began when their unrest resulted in a new economic policy that gave them more freedom. Stalin didn't like that. When Stalin at last established his stronghold, he decided to destroy Ukrainian peasantry. Through widespread intimidation, arrests, imprisonments, he took out church leaders, Ukrainian intellects, party functionaries, and basically anyone who opposed him. Then in August 1932, he decreed that if anyone, even a child, was caught taking produce from a collective field, they could be shot or imprisoned. He sealed the borders so no one could leave, and they were all forced to starve to death. And finally, it ended in 1933 when Stalin essentially got what he wanted. Number 4, the Spanish Inquisition. Ah yes, the classic Monty Python joke. But if it is a joke, then why is it on here? Well, good friends, that's because it was terrifying. And we are talking about witch trials, and this is kind of like that. Nobody knows exactly how many people died during this time, but it's estimated to be anywhere from 30,000 to 300,000. Big jump. Basically, it was a purge of non-believers by the Vatican, especially those in the Jewish community. Tomás de Torquemada was one such evil man during the event who played the role as Grand Inquisitor for a time. If you weren't Catholic, you were given 2 choices. 1, convert, or 2, be burned at the stake for heresy. There was really no in between. He, along with many others, used cruel measures of torments, and even worse, do you want to know how long this lasted? Yes. Nope, not 10 years, not 15, 350 years. Number 3, residential schools. Yeah, this one's rough. You may have heard a lot about residential schools recently, as over 1,000 bodies and unmarked graves have been found across Canada, and there's bound to be more. Residential schools were government and church-sponsored religious schools designed to assimilate Indigenous children to a Euro-Canadian culture. They tore children away from their families, and over 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended the schools. More than 38,000 Indigenous people experienced horrendous abuse of both a physical and depraved nature at the hands of residential school teachers and priests. Former students have testified that people died from disease, accidents, fires during attempts to escape, or killed to cover up nefarious affairs. When family members died, mothers and fathers were never even told where they were buried. The residential school period of Canadian history is terrifying, and for a while wasn't really talked about. I didn't learn about them until I came to university, and then recalled a story I was told of how nuns used to make molasses candies and put them on school desks to encourage Indigenous children. I wasn't told about anything else. The reality wasn't nearly as pretty. The last school closed as recently as 1996, and so far 1,300 suspected unmarked graves have been found through radar technology, with dozens more schools to be left searched. Number 2, Khmer Rouge. Orchestrated by Cambodian leader Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge was one of the most horrific points in history. Much worse than the Salem Witch Trials. It's like, that's nothing compared to this. During 1975 to 79, the totalitarian leader caused the death of over 2 million people through forced labor, starvation, disease, torment, persecution, and blatant execution. Pot and his radical communist society was trying to purify society in order to make capitalism and other Western ideologies disappear. I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying this would be to live through. This is the real 1984. He cut off all media outlets along with communication with embassies, education was stopped, healthcare was eliminated, he basically locked Cambodia off from the rest of the world. He knew that anyone with intellect would threaten his regime, so he eliminated anyone who symbolized that, even people who wore glasses. There was the police, doctors, lawyers, teachers, ex-soldiers along with their families. He took all of them out. He forced everyone into what became known as the killing fields and forced them to work off of only 180 grams of rice a day. It took years for his peers to finally have enough of him and lock Pot away under house arrest, but even then he was never really truly punished. Khmer Rouge was finally overthrown by invading Vietnamese troops in 1979, but it was only until the 1990s to the early 2000s after Pot died that prosecutions began. Number 1, World War II. The whole thing. All of it. Outside and inside this war, it was a horrendous time. Like, I probably don't even need to go too far into this. I mean, if you look at all the lists I've ever done about evil people, a lot of them come from World War II specifically. From rations to constant threats of bombings to, of course, the hundreds of war crimes. This war was the depiction of good and evil facing off. The Holocaust is probably one of the cruelest points of history, where over 6 million people were killed just for their religious beliefs or point-blank immutable qualities. There was no shortage of horrors before, during, and even right after. Not only were lives of millions upon millions taken, but many were tormented or experimented on in vicious and cruel ways. Even though it ended in victory for the Allies, the 2 nuclear bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki announced to the world what would happen if we had a World War III. Alan Turing, the man who basically is the reason the Allies won, was punished for who he chose to love. So it was just like an insane time, and I can't even imagine living through it. And with that, there is no denying that the Salem Witch Trials were bad. But considering how easy this list was to write, it does show that there is no shortage of evil in this world. But let's not forget about the good too. And with that, I've been your host, Rachel Fisher. Like, comment, subscribe if this list was your jam. Until next time, take care, folks.